Well, now we're going to take a fairly dramatic turn in our quest to understand the nature of hope as a biological phenomenon. We're going to stop talking about humans all the time and turn our attention instead to a discussion of whether animals have hope. Non-human animals. Do they have hope? If hope is truly an evolutionary phenomenon and the product of natural selection, then we ought to be able to find at least vestiges of hope in other animals, if not full-blown hope in the same way we understand it as human beings. So we're going to spend 2 presentations doing this, the first of which will cover some experimental studies on animals to try to experimentally determine whether or not animals have this thing that we humans call hope. And then, in the next module, we're going to take a very different tack and look at what we're calling anecdotal evidence for hope in animals. And this will be a module that lacks the same scientific basis that the other material we've been discussing has, but I think it's nonetheless important to have this information as sort of a full-scale, comprehensive understanding of hope in animals, including humans. So with that, as a brief introduction, let's get started. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we are going to look at hope in animals in the second presentation as defined by some non-scientific anecdotal studies. These are not controlled studies, and often there are very small sample sizes involved. So we'll just admit at the outset that when we get to this discussion of anecdotal evidence for hope in animals, which will be in the next module, we are running full scale into the question of anthropomorphism, or the projection of human traits onto other items. Could be animals, could be inanimate objects, etc. And there's a strong prejudice against doing that in legitimate mainstream science. So I'm just going to throw that out there for your consideration at the outset. We're not trying to hide from this, nor am I trying to make more of this material than should be made. But I think it brings up some interesting things that we'd be well advised to incorporate in our worldview, and that's why we're going to be doing it. Plus, animals are often the source of human inspiration, and humans themselves derive solace and or inspiration from considering the nature of hope in animals. So those are the 2 reasons why we'll be taking this on, even though, admittedly, it is not strictly a scientific question or understanding. But as promised, we're going to begin our discussion with a look at scientific studies of hope on animals. That will be the content of this module. And we're going to begin with some fairly old studies conducted by a scientist named Richter, who wanted to study hope employing the technique we call the forced swim experiments. He was working with 2 different groups of rats. The first group were domesticated rats, the white rats that you often associate with laboratory research. And these rats have been used repeatedly in a variety of different experiments in the laboratory of Richter. Often these experiments involved flight or fright kinds of modalities. So the organisms, the rats, were put into a situation where they had to choose, when confronted with a very negative stimulus, whether they would try to run away or try to fight it. And they've been put through these kinds of experiments for many months. So they had lots of experience in confronting these very negative stimuli and repeatedly being rescued from those stimuli. So that was the experience of the domesticated rats. They also looked at a second group of rats. These were wild rats, rats that you would find, for instance, running around a sewer or in a barn or something like that. And they were taken right out of the wild. They had not been handled. They had not been used in experiments. They had no experience with that situation as the previous domestic rats had. And so these were the two contrasting groups that Richter used in his 1957 experiments in a paper entitled On the Phenomenon of Sudden Death in Animals and Man. So in the forced swim experiments that Richter designed, the rats, beginning with the domestic rats, the white rats, were put into a jar filled with water. There was nowhere in the jar for the rats to climb out of the water, and as a consequence of being in water with no landing spot where they could get out, they were forced to swim in order to breathe. And what they found in these studies is that if you put a rat into that situation, well, if you put a domestic rat, one that had been handled and used in experiments repeatedly, in that situation, the rats would swim for 6 to 8 hours before they died of exhaustion. They simply could not swim any longer, and they drowned as a consequence. But prior to that time, prior to the 6 to 8 hours, they would swim their little hearts out, desperately trying to get out of the jar or find a place where they could pull themselves out of the water. Sadly, it was all in vain. But then, when they put the wild rats in the same experimental setup, they got a much different result. Remember that the wild rats had no history of working with humans. They had been taken straight off the streets, as it were, and they were just thrown into these experiments. They had no history of being put into an experimental setup and living through it or being rescued from it. So the wild rats, when they were confronted with this situation in which they had to swim in order to survive and would quickly survey the surroundings to determine whether there was a way to get out, could they crawl up on a landing and escape the water? When they determined that they could not, the wild rats had a much different reaction than the domestic rats. The wild rats went on suicide dives after 2 to 3 minutes. In other words, when they perceived that there was no hope, they simply killed themselves rather than try to endure what seemed to be a hopeless situation. And presumably the difference in that result was that nothing in the rats' history had given them a clue about how to get out of that situation. They perceived it, evaluated it as hopeless. They decided to kill themselves rather than suffer whatever terrible thing was in store for them. Well, just to be sure that this interpretation was correct, Richter then took another group of wild rats straight out of the wild, and he put them also in the swimming experiment. But prior to doing the real forced swim experiment, Richter put them in the forced swim setup, but he rescued the wild rats after a minute or two. And that was repeated several times with the same rats. Then, those same rats, those wild rats, having gone through this repeated rescue from the water, were put into the actual forced swim experiments where they were asked to swim as long as they possibly could. But unlike their first reaction, if the wild rats had been conditioned to expect rescue, as they had been in this second wild rat experiment, the wild rats would now swim for 6 to 8 hours too, just like the domestic rats, because, as Richter put it, they had hope of being rescued, and they swam and swam until they could swim no more, and they died of exhaustion. Well, they died of drowning because they were exhausted. So that's the Richter experiments. A more recent author has done another rat-based swimming experiment. In this case, Rats were put into a fairly large swimming pool filled with water. The rats were seen to swim vigorously around the edge for about 5 minutes. These rats had not been conditioned with repeated rescues as the other rats had. After 5 minutes, the rats swam less energetically, usually in the middle, and finally they just began floating in the water. The authors of this study interpreted this behavior as symptoms of depression. In other words, the rats kind of assessed the situation, discovered that there's no way out, and their reaction, at least initially, was to try to conserve energy by floating in the middle of the pool until that no longer worked and they had to start swimming again. Another group of rats, under the same investigators, had neurons stimulated in their brain that induced depression. So this is obviously a much later study in which we had brain scans to tell us which parts of the brain were connected to depression, and we had the ability to insert electrodes and stimulate those neurons so that they were active in the rats. So these rats had electrically induced depression before they were put into the swimming test, and when they were put into the swimming test in that condition, these rats stopped swimming much sooner than the rats that had not had their brains stimulated to activate circuits which we interpreted as depression in the rats. And finally, if you took those rats and treated them with antidepressants, then under those situations, even though they had their neurons stimulated to induce depression, if they were then given antidepressants, they swam as long as the controls. So both the Richter studies and these more recent studies indicate that a condition like depression occurs in rats when they're confronted with a situation for which they perceive no exit. Now we're going to move on to some other experiments on hope in animals. There's a very rich literature on the psychology of learning that has provided us with some interesting information about the notion of hope in animals, kind of as an offshoot. So there's been a lot of concern about how people learn, how people perceive information, how they process it in their minds, and this is what promotes our interest, the motivation that is required to overcome obstacles in the basic act of learning. So there were a number of early experiments that were done on animals that were based on classical conditioning experiments. So what would happen in these cases is that the animal was trained to learn that a warning light or some other innocuous signal, like a light, would precede a distinctly adverse stimulus like a shock. And of course, the response of the animal is to want to escape the shock or avoid it if possible. And so the animal learns to take avoidance action at the presentation of the stimulus, which precedes the adverse reaction. So when the light comes on, the animals start to take avoidance action. So this kind of presented a conundrum that defied the reigning theories of the day, because it was believed at the time that in order for a behavior to be repeatedly taken, that reinforcement for that behavior had to be forthcoming. So the reinforcement for the attempt to escape is obvious, namely it is the shock. And here's the problem with that, or the conundrum. But how can the absence of shock elicit the same response? How does the behavior get reinforced in the absence of that adverse stimulus? The problem was that avoidance could only be reinforced, and here's the kicker, if the shock were anticipated, if it were expected by the rat. But because there was such a prejudice against anthropomorphism at that time and for many decades going forward, that was not considered a rational thing for an animal to do. In other words, animals simply weren't capable of that level of rationality. And this then sort of segued into another kind of experiment that dealt with hope in animals. And again, this is, we did this in the last two lectures ourselves. We looked at hope in a positive way as a function of neurochemicals in one lecture, and then we looked at hope as the absence of hope or hopelessness in the next one. And this is kind of what is happening here. The psychologist Martin Seligman, who for many decades was at the University of Pennsylvania, was interested in depression. He was interested in many aspects of depression, including the effects of depression on learning and basically on securing a good life. And he did some pretty grisly experiments on animals to see if we could learn something about human hope and depression from looking at animal hope and depression. And what he discovered is that if an animal is repeatedly hurt by an adverse stimulus like a shock that it cannot escape, it will simply stop trying to escape and avoid the stimulus, or the shock in this case. So when the opportunity to escape comes at a later time, and the opportunity to escape is an easy one to access, even under those conditions, the animal simply will not try to escape. It will not try to get out of the bad situation that it is in. And this phenomenon is known as learned helplessness. So let me give you an overview of some of the experiments that Seligman did to demonstrate this. He worked most often with dogs, and I'm going to first discuss the basic experiment, and then in part two I'm going to elaborate on that experiment and how it demonstrated learned helplessness. So in the first sort of setup foundational experiment, he took 3 groups of dogs. The dogs in group 1 were put into a harness for a long period of time and then released, and that's all he did to them. The dogs in the second group were given electrical shocks. However, the dogs could escape those shocks by pressing a lever, and not surprisingly, the dogs rapidly learned to press that lever and avoid the shock. But the dogs in group 3 were given shocks from which they could not escape. And they were basically held in place and given the shocks, and they couldn't move. They just had to stand there and take those shocks. And that's the group that learned to be helpless. And they learned helplessness was demonstrated in the second experiment, or part 2 of the Seligman dog experiments. All the dogs in the part 1, all 3 groups were moved into the second phase of the experiment. In the second phase, the dogs in all 3 groups were presented with shocks, but all 3 groups, the dogs in all 3 groups, could escape by jumping over a partition, and the partition was fairly low, it was easy to jump over. It was not difficult to get out of the zone where they were being shocked. So the dogs in groups 1 and 2, the dogs that had been put into a harness in one case, and in the second case had received electrical shocks but could stop the shocks by pressing a lever. In the second experiment, both of those groups of dogs easily jumped the partition and avoided subsequent shocks. However, the dogs in group 3 just lay there and whined while suffering through the shocks that repeatedly ravaged them. They did this even though they could easily have escaped had they not learned to be helpless. So learned helplessness, according to Seligman and those who followed him, is a form of hopelessness. It's also a form of giving up because you see your situation as completely hopeless. We also see this in very sick animals who are suffering a lot, and at some point they may just lose the will to live entirely, and basically they just die. So both learned helplessness and loss of will to live in response to the perception that one's destiny cannot be controlled, that one's fate is solid, that you cannot escape it, that there's a complete loss of agency on behalf of the individual. That is a situation in which we see learned helplessness or hopelessness. It may be preceded by classical symptoms of depression, and in some studies, it is attended by reductions in serotonin level. It's a very serious thing, and we really need to be aware of these results because, of course, we're very concerned with what happens to human beings. And there are situations which, if they occur in early childhood, can result in learned helplessness, or learned hopelessness, if you prefer that descriptor, in human beings. And the symptoms can be quite dire. They include increased aggression, decreased capacity for maternal care, decreased appetite, increased responses to opiate drugs, which is one reason why people who are very depressed may have an opiate drug problem. Significant changes in learning style. So if you're a young person and you're experiencing horrible things all the time, if you get into this cycle of depression where you think that you have no control over your fate, one of the other bad things that can happen to you is that you don't learn the right way. You don't learn the material you're seeing in school, and that just further decreases your ability to cope. The neurochemical measurements taken of animals and people in this situation show results that look a lot like depression neurochemically. But if there's any good news to be had from these experiments and these studies in humans as well, it is that if it's possible to learn helplessness and hopelessness, it's probably also possible to unlearn it. So with that possibly hopeful outcome, I leave you for this part of the discussion. So thus far, the studies we've looked at collectively, and as well as other studies that we haven't talked about, show that animals, like humans, have a basic requirement for hope in order to live. If animals are presented with a situation where they believe that there is no hope, they just give up or they die, or at a minimum, they become severely depressed and are unable to respond normally to regular stimuli. And if the studies by Richter with the wild rats are true, animals may even show suicidal behavior when they believe that they are in a state of true hopelessness. And now we're going to transition to yet another experimental study, but this one hit the news and made a splash in ways that perhaps weren't entirely intended by the authors, but it just shows you the fine line between rigorous scientific thought and the way that some of this information gets changed when it gets out into the press. So I'm going to talk to you today about a study whose title was Western Scrub Jay Funerals, cacophonous aggregations in response to dead conspecifics, which was published in Animal Behavior 4 years ago. And because of the use of the word funeral in the title, it also was picked up by several news agencies and was written up in various popular media to ostensibly answer the question about whether birds could mourn their dead. But let's go back and look at the details, some of the details of this paper, and determine whether or not that's an accurate description of what the paper in fact did. We do know that all organisms have to contend with death, but the question we want to ask is, do animals actually mourn the death of another member of their species? Certainly, the study we're going to be looking at shows that the sight of a dead scrub jay can cause other scrub jays to start to sing, to vocalize, and that really is the substance of the paper. But as I said, the use of the word funeral in the title took it in a quite different direction once the mainstream press got a hold of it. So here's some more information about the experimental setup of that study. The cacophonous aggregations referred to in the title, also abbreviated CA because it's a long phrase, were what happened when a particular scrub jay would come across a dead scrub jay. In that situation, the living scrub jay, now having found a dead conspecific simply means another member of the same species. So when the living bird comes upon a dead bird, the live scrub jay would begin to sing and hop around from perch to perch, calling loudly. And this would then summon other members of the same species. Other scrub jays would arrive and start to do the same thing. They'd be attracted to the area where the dead bird was by the first sentinel scrub jay, who found the dead bird and started to call and hop around, and that would get other birds, the same species, to come to the same area and do the same thing. So what they were trying to do in this paper is to determine why this happened. Why were these birds engaging in this cacophonous aggregation in response to finding a dead scrub jay? The paper includes a series of 4 experiments in which different stimuli were presented at feeding stations where scrub jays were likely to amass to get the food. And then they did some manipulations to determine whether the gathering of all of the scrub jays and the calling reaction were the result of finding the actual dead scrub jay, or whether that behavior could be elicited by other kinds of stimuli as well. So there were a series of 4 experiments done in this paper, which is quite long, and we're not going to discuss all of them, but we are going to discuss what happened when a live jay was presented with a series of different stimuli. One of these stimuli was an actual dead scrub jay. Or it could have been one of several so-called novel objects that were left at the feeding stations to see whether these novel objects invoked the same cacophonous aggregation that the dead jay did. So the dead jay was basically just a dead jay, a stuffed dead jay. Other things that were left at the feeding stations to see whether they evoked the cacophonous aggregation were a stuffed owl that was perched in an upright position to make the scrub jays believe that the owl was live, and because owls are predators of scrub jays, that was likely to frighten them and perhaps evoke the calling response. They included dead scrub jays in a prone or prostrate position, laying down on the ground. And they included feathers of live scrub jays, but strewn around in a way that might mimic a dead scrub jay. And lastly, they included blue sticks that were colored the same color as a dead scrub jay, and the sticks were arrayed in a manner that approached what the feathers of the live scrub jay looked like when they were spread around the ground to imitate a dead jay. So under all of these situations, the response of the living jays were recorded and their behavior was tallied. So here are the various kinds of stimuli that were presented. Down here we have, let's get our little thing up. Down here we have an actual jay, it's dead, but it's been stuffed and it's perched in an upright position to make any scrub jay arriving in the area think that this is a live bird. Over here we have the stuffed owl that looks quite alive, and because this is a predator of scrub jays, it's likely to invoke some sort of fear response. Here we have the feathers of an actual jay scattered around the ground in a way that might evoke a fear response if this is interpreted as a dead jay. And these are the blue sticks that are similar in color to the actual jay. And here the wood is strewn around the ground in a similar manner to the feathers of the actual bird. So their goal was to study whether these different stimuli evoked a cacophonous aggregation. They had a total of 14 different feeding locations, and what they did was to present one of the novel objects that we referenced in the previous slide for a number of days, and then they would follow that with the actual dead jay 10 to 14 days later. They didn't randomize the order of presentation of the novel objects, just as an aside. And it turns out that the novel stimuli were largely ignored by the jays. The cacophonous aggregation was seen largely in response to the dead jay, the jay that was lying down on the ground. However, the predator also evoked some responses that were quite significant. Here we have two graphics, both of which have histograms in them. Over here, on the y-axis, we're tallying the number of calls in response to the different stimuli. This is the histogram that tallies the number of calls to an actual dead jay lying on the ground. You can see that there are a lot of calls, so this clearly evoked the cacophonous aggregation response. However, the novel object, this would be the blue feathers and the blue sticks, evoked nothing. There may be one or two calls in there, but nothing that comes close to the number of calls when an actual dead jay is present. However, when the owl was present, we saw an awful lot of calls, and a similar number to the presence of the dead jay. So both the presentation of the owl and the dead jay evoked a lot of calling. So we can summarize the data on the previous slide simply by saying that the jay's calls increased dramatically when confronted by a dead jay, as opposed to the blue sticks or the blue feathers lying on the ground. And the number of calls elicited by the jays were about the same when the jays were confronted with either the stuffed owl, which was interpreted as a predator, versus an actual dead jay. So, the question remains, is the response, the call response of the living jays, a warning to the other living jays that the dead jay is present and that danger of some sort might therefore be present? They did another assessment of this in the same experiment. In this case, they are again using dead jays versus a novel object. Again, that would be the blue sticks versus the blue feathers. They also looked at dead jays versus owls. So it's the same comparisons that we saw on the previous slide, but this time they were measuring the number of nuts eaten at the feeding station. And what they found was that if an actual dead jay is present at the feeding station, then almost all feeding was suspended. The incoming live jays didn't eat very much. The presentation of the dead jay made them all weary, and they didn't feed as they normally would have. However, when one of the novel objects was present, the feathers strewn on the ground or the blue sticks, feeding was not impacted. If we look at dead jays versus owls, Again, the owls were interpreted as a predator. The dead jay was interpreted as a dead jay. And in the case of the predator presentation, there was no feeding whatsoever. In the case of the dead jay, there was a limited, very low number of live jays taking peanuts from the feeding station, but much, much reduced in contrast to that which was done in the case of the novel objects. So seeing a dead jay greatly reduced food consumption compared to when the feathers versus the sticks were presented. And seeing a predator in the form of an owl eliminated feeding altogether and was greatly, greatly reduced when they saw a dead jay. So the jays will suspend their eating behavior in the presence of a predator, and there's very little eating when the dead jay is present. So what did they conclude from all of this? Well, the authors concluded that the living jays use the dead jays as kind of a public sentinel, as an information about risk in the neighborhood, and that this information is shared with conspecifics by the calling and the hopping behaviors. The dead jay, according to the authors, signifies danger, similar to the owl, and you indeed saw that the reduction in feeding and the increased number of calls was quite similar to that of the owls. And this causes the jays to stop eating and broadcast danger to other jays, according to the authors. The calls of the jays in response to predators was similar to the vocal patterns that were sung in response to the dead jay. So, okay, that sounds semi-plausible, but here's what disturbs me about that interpretation, and that is, it's not clear why living jays would summon other living jays to the area where the dead conspecific is located. If there's danger in that area, wouldn't the living jay who arrives first want to warn other jays away from that area so that they too don't get killed, they don't suffer the same fate as their dead conspecific? I'm not sure why that makes sense with that set of provisos. On the other hand, if this were a social gathering around the dead jay, that might explain why others would be summoned to, pay last respects to the dead jay, send him off in the way that humans do. And that is, in fact, what promoted the use of the word funeral in the title. But in the discussion that comes at the end of the paper, there's very little discussion of, this is a bird funeral. They simply throw that out as an enticing idea, but they don't really discuss it in the discussion part of the paper, nor do they make much of it as a point of the paper. So Lauren Isley will have a lot more to say about stuff like this in the next module. Thus far, I think we can conclude that humans find hope and motivation in the behavior of animals. That's one reason why we study them. Do the animals themselves feel hope in these situations? I think that the experimental studies indicate that hope in animals does exist. If they lack hope, then they do bad things or they suffer bad fates. Now, can we render these behaviors into the firing of neurons under the influence of specific neurotransmitters? Well, we can certainly do it to some extent. But we might want to entertain the possibility that animals are not merely automatons whose neurons are firing randomly and then in a predictive kind of way. Maybe there's a bigger social picture that animals are part of, just like humans are. So I think we'll take that up in greater detail in the next module. And whether or not you want to see this as animals having some sort of greater social sense that is similar to humans, well, that would be your choice. And I just present you data and you make the decision. So here is your study guide for the current module, parts 1, 2, and 3.